I always knew my sister resented me. But I never expected her to stand up in front of the whole family and call me a thief. Not in our mother's dining room. Not with a glass of wine in her hand and that smug little smile I hadn't seen since we were teenagers. Not while I was still chewing my first bite of roast chicken, heart already pounding from the tension I'd walked into. My name is Amber. I'm 32. And last night, I watched my family pretend to be surprised as my sister Rachel accused me, publicly, of stealing our grandfather's estate. It would have almost been funny if it hadn't been so predictable. They'd been circling me ever since the funeral. First came the questions, disguised as concern. Then the pressure. The guilt trips. The veiled threats. And now, a performance. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I put down my fork, wiped my mouth with the napkin, and looked her dead in the eye. I think, I said calmly, you should finish what you're trying to say. And she did. She said I manipulated a dying old man. That I used my closeness with Grandpa Harold to influence him. That I had no right to the house, the money, the business assets. That the estate, the one he built from nothing, should have gone to our mother. Not me. I listened, not because I didn't know what she'd say, but because I needed everyone else to hear it too. All the little players in this ugly family theater. My stepfather Craig, red-faced and useless. My younger brother Jason, avoiding eye contact. And my mother, Patricia, watching it all with that cold, satisfied expression that always made me feel like I was 12 years old again. It was a strange thing, sitting at that table. In the same room where I'd once done my homework while my mother threw designer shoes across the floor, screaming about overdraft fees. The same house where I'd listened to Grandpa's voice on the phone, calm and steady, telling me to keep my head down and my heart strong. The house I had left at 18 and never truly returned to, until he died. A month ago, Harold Bennett, my grandfather, passed away and left his entire estate to me. Not just a few sentimental items. Everything. His chain of hardware stores. His home. His investments. All of it, in my name. The will was airtight. Not even Patricia's army of lawyers could find a crack. But power doesn't have to be legal to be effective. Especially in families like mine, where control is subtle and punishment is emotional. They didn't just want the money. They wanted me to feel like I didn't deserve it. And that's why they invited me to this dinner. It wasn't to catch up. It wasn't to talk. It was to shame me. To put me back in the role I was assigned decades ago, the quiet, reasonable one. The peacekeeper. The girl who didn't make a fuss. The one who gave up her college fund so the family could keep the lights on. The one who never needed praise, or thanks, or anything at all. But I'm not that girl anymore. After Rachel's little outburst, the table fell quiet. My mother didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her silence was a verdict. Then she turned to me and said, if your grandfather were alive, he'd be disgusted. And I knew then, they'd rehearsed this. Every word. Every glance. This wasn't just about inheritance. It was about erasing what I'd become. I don't remember standing up. I just remember the air shifting, like the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. I looked at each of them. One by one. And then I told them exactly what Grandpa told me 2 weeks before he died. About the folders he gave me. About the records. About the conversations he recorded. The ones I never planned to use, until now. Rachel laughed. Of course she did. She always did when she was nervous. You're bluffing, she said. I didn't respond. I just reached into my purse, pulled out the envelope, and placed it gently on the table. Inside was a single USB drive. Patricia's smile disappeared. Craig swore under his breath. Jason finally looked at me. Let's make something clear, I said, my voice low. I didn't take anything. But I'm ready to show you what was taken, from him. The silence was sharp. Tense. The kind of silence that made your skin itch. And then the doorbell rang. Everyone turned. I knew exactly who it was. So did Patricia. She whispered, "You didn't." But I had. I opened the door. And in walked the one person none of them expected, the executor of Grandpa's private trust. And he wasn't alone. He brought witnesses. And documents. And one other thing they didn't know existed. A second will. My mother's face drained of color before the attorney even spoke. That alone was confirmation. Whatever she thought she'd buried with him wasn't buried deep enough. Mr. Kessler, the executor, gave a polite nod to the room, his expression unreadable. The man beside him, sharply dressed and younger, held a locked briefcase and a notepad. The witnesses, two older women from Harold's church, stood quietly near the entrance, their coats still buttoned. They didn't need introductions. Their presence alone spoke volumes. I stepped aside, letting the silence tighten like a noose. The last time I'd seen Patricia that still was when Grandpa announced, years ago, that I'd be managing one of his smaller stores for the summer. She'd laughed at first, assuming it was a joke. Then she'd realized it wasn't, and didn't speak to me for weeks. Now, she looked at me with something more dangerous than anger. Recognition. She knew. And maybe she had always known that I was the one thing she couldn't control. Mr. Kessler placed a slim leather binder on the dining table, ignoring the untouched dinner plates, the spilled wine, the cold roast chicken. He opened it slowly, deliberately, and spoke in that soft, precise voice attorneys reserve for bad news and bulletproof clauses. He said, "Per Harold Bennett's instructions, I am here to present an addendum to the original will, dated 18 months prior to the final document filed with probate." Craig cleared his throat. Jason fidgeted. Rachel rolled her eyes and whispered something under her breath. Kessler continued, "This supplemental directive outlines a private trust established before his final hospitalization, with explicit terms, video testimony, and oversight." He paused. It was filed in confidence. Amber was not made aware until after Harold's passing, per his instructions. That was true. I hadn't known, not entirely. I'd only learned the full extent of it when I found the key in the envelope he'd left me, tucked inside the jacket pocket of an old corduroy blazer he used to wear on Sundays. The note in his handwriting had read, "When it gets loud, use this." So I did. Kessler handed me the key and motioned for the briefcase. The young associate unlocked it, revealing a thin stack of papers, a flash drive, and, tucked inside a blue folder, a signed statement. My eye skimmed the top line, "Addendum to Living Trust, for the protection of legacy assets." I felt the room shift again. Heavier. Denser. Not one person at that table had asked what was in the documents. Because they already knew. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the narrative they'd carefully constructed, and how fast it was about to unravel. Kessler read aloud a single paragraph, something about conditional safeguards, about fiduciary discretion and direct transfer of assets to Amber Lynn Bennett, in recognition of her role as custodian of moral and financial legacy. It was pure Harold. Elegant. Surgical. Jason stood up halfway through and walked to the sink, pretending to get water. He didn't drink any. Rachel's jaw clenched so tightly I could see the bone press against her skin. Still, no one interrupted. Even Patricia stayed silent, fingers resting lightly on the stem of her wine glass, as if gripping too tightly would betray something. When Kessler finished, he handed me the folder. I didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, I looked at the witnesses, two women in their 70s, one wearing a pearl brooch I recognized from the church bake sales Harold used to drag me to as a kid. They nodded solemnly. It wasn't performative. It was closure. For them. For him. Patricia spoke first. She said, "This is obscene." I replied, "No. It's documented." She stood up slowly, not in anger, but in something colder. Calculation. She looked at Kessler, not me. She said, I want to review those terms in private. He replied, that won't be possible. This is a witness delivery. Nothing in this file is disputable. Craig muttered something about legal overreach, but no one acknowledged him. Jason finally sat back down. He hadn't looked at me once. I studied them carefully. My family. Each one turning inward, collapsing under the slow pressure of exposure. They hadn't expected me to fight. But I'd learned more from Grandpa than how to read profit margins or vet suppliers. I'd learned how to stand still in a room full of noise. How to protect something quietly, without letting the world know it was under siege. And I'd learned to wait. Rachel stood now too, trembling. Not in fear. In fury. She pointed at the envelope. She said, "You think this makes you better than us?" I replied, "No. It just makes me prepared." That was the moment the night changed. Not because I won. But because they realized they'd already lost, months ago. The narrative shifted. I could feel it like a wind turning. I wasn't the passive granddaughter anymore. I wasn't the quiet helper. I was the executor of Harold Bennett's legacy. The woman he trusted more than his own daughter. And all they had now were accusations. Rachel stormed out first. Her heels clicked down the hallway like a ticking clock. Jason followed a minute later, mumbling about needing air. Only Patricia and Craig remained. She poured another glass of wine, hand steady, lips pursed. She said, "So this was the plan. Humiliate us. Use his death as leverage." I answered, "No. The plan was to respect his wishes. I didn't make this ugly. You did." Outside, the car engine started. Doors slammed. The night fractured. Inside, I stood still. Kessler gave me a brief nod and began collecting the documents. He said quietly, "Would you like me to walk you through the next steps?" I said, "Not yet." He understood and stepped out with his team. The room emptied like a tide going out. Patricia didn't follow them. She just sat there, watching me. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She whispered, "You really think he loved you more?" It wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't cruel. It was small. Almost human. I didn't answer. Because the truth was, he didn't love me more. He just trusted me more. And for people like Patricia, that was the deepest cut of all. I left her there, in the room she'd once ruled. Walked out into the quiet night, envelope clutched tightly in my hand, heart still beating too fast. The cold air hit my skin like permission. The second will was real. The fight wasn't over. But the power had shifted. What none of them knew, what even Kessler didn't know, was that Harold had left one more thing behind. Something only I had access to. And it would change everything. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew what silence meant in my family. It wasn't surrender. It was strategy. I woke the next morning to 3 missed calls from my brother and a string of unreadable texts from Rachel. No apologies. No questions. Just half-formed accusations, vague threats, and the kind of manipulative bait I'd grown used to over the years. But Patricia didn't reach out. Not once. Which meant she was planning something. I went about my day as usual, made coffee, checked my emails, sorted through the inventory reports for the stores I now legally owned. But a low hum of dread followed me through every task, like the sound of an approaching storm you can't yet see. The trust was secure. The documents were filed. The witnesses were official. But power, in families like mine, was never just about legal standing. It was about perception. And perception, Patricia understood intimately. At 3:17 p.m. I got a call from the regional manager of the flagship store. He sounded nervous. Apologetic. He said, "Amber, I just got a call from someone claiming to be a board consultant. Said the ownership transition is under dispute. I replied, there's no board. There's no dispute. He hesitated. She said your authority could be revoked. That a petition's being filed to freeze assets pending a review. Patricia moved fast. Not legally, not yet. But socially. Financially. With whispers. She knew people. People who liked to stir dust just to watch where it settled. I thanked him, told him to continue operations as normal, and hung up. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up the encrypted folder Harold had left me. The one he never mentioned in his will. The one no one else knew existed, because I'd built the encryption system for him 2 years earlier. Just in case, he'd said. Not everyone deserves the truth. But some people need to see it. Inside were 3 subfolders. Labeled with names. Patricia. Craig. Rachel. My stomach turned. It wasn't curiosity. It was dread. I clicked Patricia's first. Dozens of audio files. Scans of loan documents. Letters I recognized from years ago, requests for money disguised as updates. Manipulative, rehearsed. But it was the recordings that mattered. One in particular. Dated 6 months before his death. Her voice sharp, practiced. She said, just give it to me, Dad. She doesn't need all that. His reply, weak but clear, you'll spend it. She'll build with it. Patricia snapped, I raised her. You owe me. And he said, after a long pause, I owe you nothing. I sat still for a long time after that. Listening to the silence that followed. Then I opened Rachel's folder. Emails. Screenshots. A video, her screaming at one of the store employees after being denied a family discount on a high-end appliance. There was a memo from Harold's personal assistant, detailing how Rachel had tried to enter his office twice while he was sedated. One note simply read, attempted to access files. Security notified. It didn't surprise me. But it exhausted me. The final folder, Craig's, was thinner. But telling. Scans of credit card statements. His name on a quiet offshore account. A folder labeled, June 2018, attempted asset transfer. That was the month Patricia had told me Harold was losing track of things. But he hadn't been losing anything. He'd been watching. The documents weren't just damning. They were deliberate. Like breadcrumbs he'd left not just for protection, but for justice. For me. Still, none of it made me feel victorious. It felt sad. Like the last echoes of a man who knew he wouldn't live long enough to confront any of it directly, so he'd placed it in my hands, knowing it would cost me something no inheritance could cover. My phone buzzed again. A voicemail from Jason. His voice was low. Strained. He said, I didn't know about any of it. I swear. But they're talking about contesting. Mom's meeting with someone. Said they'll go public if they have to. Go public. That was Patricia's language, reputation warfare. Making me look like the villain in a story she'd written decades ago. I stared at my reflection in the dark screen of my laptop. I didn't look like a thief. I looked like a woman who hadn't cried in weeks. I didn't answer Jason. There was no point. That night, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Monica Lane, the attorney who helped Harold draft the second trust. We'd only met once, briefly, but I remembered her precise tone and watchful eyes. She wasn't a family lawyer. She was a corporate strategist. The kind people called when the stakes were high and the risks personal. She answered on the second ring. I said, it's Amber Bennett. I need to meet. She didn't ask why. Just gave me a time. Friday. 9 a.m. Her office was in the financial district, high above the chaos of the city. Sleek. Cold. Efficient. I arrived early. Waited in the lobby, watching the rain slide down the tall windows like it was trying to escape. When Monica finally waved me in, she didn't smile. She just gestured to the chair. She said, "They're already building a case. I've seen the press inquiry. They want a scandal." I asked, "Can they do anything?" She folded her hands. "Legally? No. Morally? That's subjective." I understood. This wasn't about winning in court. This was about not losing in the court of perception. We went over every document. Every clause. Every recording. She listened without blinking. Asked careful questions. Took notes. After an hour, she sat back. She said, "You've got a choice. You can bury this and let it rot in silence. Or you can use it, burn the myth of your family to the ground." I looked down at my hands. They didn't tremble. I said, "What happens if I do?" She replied, "You stop being the quiet one." I stood up, heart steady. I said, "Good. Because that was the real threat, wasn't it? Not the money. Not the trust. It was the idea that I might finally speak, not in defense, but in truth." I left Monica's office and walked through the drizzle, remembering something Harold once told me in the back office of his first store. People who think they deserve everything usually can't survive owning the truth. I turned the corner and saw someone waiting by my car. Rachel. No makeup. No earrings. Just her, standing in the rain like she expected me to stop. I didn't. But she stepped in front of my door. She said, "You're not going to ruin us." I looked at her. Soaked. Furious. Cracked open. And I said, evenly, "I'm not ruining anything. I'm just done protecting lies." Then I got in, started the engine, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I watched her standing there. Not shouting. Not chasing. Just standing still, like she finally realized this wasn't a fight she could win by being louder. She'd tried to shame me into silence. Now she'd have to live with what I was about to say. There's a kind of silence that only comes after truth. Not the warm kind, not closure. Not peace. But the kind that settles into your bones after something irreversible. That's what followed me home that night. I didn't turn on any lights when I walked in. I just stood there in the dark, letting my eyes adjust, letting the quiet seep in. The USB drive Harold had compiled sat untouched on the coffee table. I hadn't played all of it yet. I wasn't ready. But I would be soon. I made tea with steady hands. Opened my laptop. And started writing. Not a manifesto. Not a confession. Just facts. Dates. Amounts. Statements. Screenshots. Attachments. Every document I'd spent the last week compiling, organizing, and validating was now lined up in a single encrypted folder. I titled it Continuity, and stored it in 3 places, one physical, one digital, one off-site. I wasn't preparing for war. I was protecting the truth. I didn't expect Rachel to back off. I expected escalation. Patricia never gave up power willingly. She wielded guilt and silence with equal force, but when neither worked, she turned to humiliation. And this time, I wouldn't be the one shamed. By morning, Monica had already drafted a preemptive legal brief in case Patricia filed a motion to contest. It was thick, annotated, and covered in careful language. But I asked her to hold it. I said, "Let her make the first move." She said, "Are you sure?" I replied, "Absolutely." Because this wasn't just legal anymore. It was personal. And people like Patricia thrived in shadows, not courts. I spent the next 3 days making preparations. I changed the passwords on all financial accounts related to the trust. Updated security settings on the company's payroll portal. Scheduled a quiet audit through a third-party accounting firm. All internal. All compliant. no announcements. Just clean lines and hard numbers. At Harold's main office, I requested keycards be reviewed. One name kept popping up. Craig. He'd been using his access regularly, after hours, even after Harold's death. No transactions, no theft. Just presence. Walking the halls. Sitting in Harold's office. Logging into his old desktop, which was now completely wiped. It wasn't just unsettling. It was revealing. Craig had always played the role of the affable stepfather. Hands off. Neutral. But Harold never trusted him. Not really. And the empty login records told me why. He'd been looking for something. And he hadn't found it. Because I had it. I started reviewing the employee rosters more closely. 6 managers. For longtime employees Harold had mentioned in his private notes. 2 he hadn't. One name stood out, a recent hire. Jason's friend from college. Placed into a mid-level operations role 6 months ago, with no prior retail experience. I called the HR lead and asked her to forward the original application and references. She hesitated. She said, "Is there a concern?" I said, "There's a review in progress. Please expedite." The file was messy. Incomplete. No formal interview documentation. A favor. That's what this hire was. And I was starting to see just how many favors were hiding under the surface of Harold's carefully constructed business. On Thursday, I visited the oldest store, the original one Harold opened when he was barely 30. The manager there, Mr. Dalton, had known me since I was a child. He didn't smile when he saw me. He just walked over and placed a folded envelope in my hand. He said, "Your grandfather asked me to give this to you when things started to shift." I asked, "Why didn't you give it sooner?" He answered, "Because I was hoping it wouldn't come to this." Inside was a hand-drawn map of the office layout, with a small red X marked under the floorboards behind the shelving unit. That night, I found the compartment. Inside were 3 things. A small ledger notebook, dated from the year I was born until the year Harold retired. A thumb drive labeled personal, eyes only. And a photo, me and Harold at the store grand reopening when I was 12, standing under a balloon arch, both of us laughing. His handwriting on the back, "For the only one who listened." I didn't cry. I couldn't. Instead, I drove to Monica's office again, the envelope on the seat beside me like a second heartbeat. We reviewed the contents together in silence. The ledger outlined financial movements, investments Harold had made quietly, without board approval, over decades. All of them now matured. All of them tied back to me. He'd been building a secondary foundation. Not to hide wealth. To shield it. Monica scanned the documents slowly. She said, "This is the insurance." I nodded. It wasn't just enough to survive what was coming. It was enough to bury any counterclaim, not with force, but with proof. Proof of planning. Proof of intent. Proof of trust. That night, Rachel sent one final text. Just 4 words, "You win. For now." I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't surrender. It was a warning. I typed a reply, then deleted it. There was nothing left to say. The next morning, I stood in front of the office mirror, adjusting my blazer. I looked older. Sharper. Not harder, just clearer. The same eyes, but not the same woman. Downstairs, the documents were stacked neatly in my bag. Bound, notarized, and labeled. Today, I wasn't going to war. I was going to the bank. To transfer the final set of assets. The trust was mine. The business was mine. But the silence that came with it, the weight of legacy, that was something else entirely. Outside, the rain had stopped. And I knew exactly what the next move would be. Because Patricia wasn't finished. Not yet. There was still one card she hadn't played. And I was already 3 steps ahead of her. I knew she'd never come alone. When Patricia finally requested a meeting, it wasn't through a call or text. It came as a formal email and signed, but unmistakably her. The subject line read, "Proposal discussion, family transition concerns." Not a question. Not a request. An orchestration. The location was neutral, sterile, a conference room on the 27th floor of a downtown law firm that had once handled the trust's tax advisory. It was her territory. Not legally, but reputationally. Her name meant something in those circles. Or used to. I arrived 10 minutes early. Waited in the hallway, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted them to walk in first, to feel, for once, the exposure of being watched. Assessed. When the elevator opened, she stepped out with Craig beside her, followed by Jason, who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Then came Rachel. Dressed like she hadn't been crying. Overdressed, actually. Her mouth tight. Eyes puffy beneath layers of concealer. She wouldn't look at me. A paralegal opened the conference room door. We all entered wordlessly. Inside, a long oak table, a tray of untouched water glasses, 2 legal counsels, one for them, one neutral, and a court recorder. Monica was already seated. She didn't smile at me. Just nodded once. Patricia sat at the head of the table. A deliberate move. I chose the seat directly opposite. They waited for me to blink first. I didn't. Monica began. She said, "Let the record show that Amber Bennett, as primary beneficiary and trustee, is present. We are here at the request of the opposing party." Patricia interrupted, gracefully, with a slight wave of her hand, as if this was all far too formal for such a family matter. She said, "We're not here to dispute Harold's wishes. We're here to resolve misunderstandings. As a family." I replied, "Misunderstanding implies something wasn't clear." Her smile thinned. But she recovered quickly. She said, "Perhaps not misunderstanding, then. Misdirection. You've painted a picture that doesn't reflect the complexity of what Harold intended." She paused, let the silence breathe, then added, "He wasn't himself those last few months." There it was. The real strategy, undermining his capacity. Quietly discrediting the man whose empire she now claimed had slipped into confusion before his death. Jason shifted in his seat. Craig stayed quiet, unreadable. Rachel finally spoke. She said, "You manipulated him. Used his illness to turn him against us." I turned to Monica. She nodded. I opened the folder in front of me. The first page was a notarized medical assessment, Harold's mental capacity evaluation dated just 3 weeks before the revised trust was signed. Clear. Unambiguous. Competent. I slid it across the table. Then I spoke, still calm. I said, "Do you want to proceed with the narrative that he was confused?" Patricia looked at the document. Didn't touch it. Didn't need to. She understood what it meant. The legal path was blocked. So she pivoted. She said, "We believe there's still time to do the right thing, Amber. The stores, the home, they belong to all of us. He may have signed things over, but family should share." She used the word share like a weapon. I leaned forward, gently. I said, "He shared his values. Not just his assets." That cracked something. Rachel's chair scraped suddenly as she stood. She said, "You think this makes you powerful? You think any of this makes you loved?" It wasn't rhetorical. It was a wound. I didn't answer. Because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Craig finally cleared his throat. He said, quietly, "What do you want, Amber? Just say it." That was the moment I understood how scared they really were. Because they thought I wanted revenge. I looked around the table, at my brother's clenched hands, Rachel's glassy eyes, my mother's controlled breathing. The truth was, I didn't want anything from them. I stood up, slowly, letting my chair slide back. I said, "This isn't about wanting. It's about protecting what he built." Then I handed Monica the final envelope, the letter Harold had handwritten 2 weeks before his death. It was sealed, witnessed, and addressed to the board of trustees overseeing the company's external licensing. Monica read the contents aloud. In it, Harold stated that any challenge to Amber's control should be considered a betrayal of both his intent and his values. That any internal family disputes should not delay operations, and that all licensing and board votes would be redirected to her discretion until further notice. Patricia turned white. Because this wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was about power, the kind she thought she still had. I didn't linger. I let Monica distribute the remaining documents. As I walked to the door, Patricia stood. She said, "This isn't over." I turned slightly. I replied, "No. But your version of it is." Outside, the hallway was cold and quiet. A receptionist looked up and smiled faintly. I didn't smile back. Not because I wasn't relieved. But because relief wasn't the point. Control was never the goal. Clarity was. When I reached the elevator, I pressed the button and waited. Behind me, the door remained closed. I thought that would be the end of it. But I was wrong. That night, someone left an envelope at my apartment door. Unmarked. Inside was a single photograph of me and Harold. A copy of the one I'd found in the floorboards. And on the back, a line in handwriting that wasn't his. Just 4 words. "He never loved you." I didn't flinch. Because I knew who sent it. But what they didn't know, what they could never know, was what else I'd found in that envelope beneath the store's floor. And that final piece of truth? I was saving it. Not to win. But to finish this. For good. Hate always looks for the last word. But when it doesn't get it, it folds itself into silence, poisonous and unfinished. That was the energy in the days that followed. No more calls. No texts. No more staged ambushes pretending to be conversations. Just the envelope. The photo. The words meant to break something in me. But I didn't crack. I made myself tea. I folded laundry. I signed documents. And then I went to the safe and opened the second compartment Harold had built into the trust. Inside was the final thing he left me. Not money. Not property. A confession. Typed. Signed. Dated 2 years before he died. It outlined everything he'd suspected, about Patricia, about Craig, about forged signatures from the early days of the business. It wasn't enough to press charges. Not alone. But it was enough to show intent. And more importantly, enough to explain why he chose me. He had included a handwritten note, folded between the pages. Just one line. There are people who inherit titles, and people who carry legacies. You'll know which one you are when it costs you something. That stayed with me. Because it had cost me. More than I could put into words. In the weeks after the confrontation, the business stabilized. Monica coordinated a quiet transition in management. Jason resigned from the operations team. No explanation. No goodbye. Just absence. Rachel unfollowed me on every platform. I checked once. Then never again. I heard through an employee that Craig had been quietly removed from one of the vendor contracts. Some inconsistencies in purchase orders had surfaced during the audit I'd initiated. Nothing prosecutable. Just embarrassing. Enough to ensure he wouldn't be invited back. But it was Patricia who remained the loudest in her silence. She hadn't spoken publicly, but I could feel her maneuvering behind the scenes, little press leaks, quiet slander through concerned friends, attempts to paint me as unstable, opportunistic, vindictive. The same narrative she'd always tried to assign to anyone who left her grasp. But it didn't land the way she thought it would. Because she underestimated how much people had seen over the years, the way she'd held court at family events, how she'd dismissed waitstaff, how she'd talked over everyone except Harold. People remembered things. And memory, when stirred, is its own form of justice. The final test came in the form of a letter. Not legal. Personal. It arrived in a heavy cream envelope, no return address, but her handwriting unmistakable. Inside, 4 pages, front and back. She accused me of breaking the family apart. Of manipulating Harold in his final years. Of embarrassing her, publicly and permanently. She said I had no idea how hard it was to raise a family, how many sacrifices she had made. And then she wrote something I hadn't expected. You were never meant to be part of the story. You were the side plot. The one who was supposed to fade quietly. I read it twice. Then burned it. Not out of rage. But to make space for what came next. Because I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The paperwork was complete. The estate closed. The board restructured. The final licensing approval had just come in, my name now recognized as lead director for every operating location. But I didn't celebrate. I sat in Harold's office, the one I'd left untouched until now, and opened the old drawer he used to keep receipts in. There was still a jar of peppermints. Still the photo of me from my high school graduation, taped inside the top drawer. I took out a pen and began drafting a letter. Not to Patricia. Not to Rachel. Not even to Jason. To the employees. To the ones who'd worked through the transition quietly, loyally. I thanked them for their patience. For their grace. I told them I wouldn't be taking a salary the first year. That bonuses would be reinstated. That we were entering a new chapter, not just on paper, but in principle. I ended it simply, legacy is not what we take. It's what we leave whole. I read it aloud once. Then folded it, signed it, and gave it to the communications manager to distribute. 3 days later, I got a reply from a cashier at one of the small-town locations. She wrote, I stayed because I felt something shift. Not in the company. In the air. Thank you for not leaving it to rot. I read that message more times than I care to admit. It was the only thank you I received that felt real. No performance. No obligation. Just truth. That weekend, I returned to Harold's house. I hadn't been back since the funeral. The air still smelled like old paper and lemon oil. I walked through each room slowly. No nostalgia. Just acknowledgement. This wasn't home. It had never been. But it was where something had started, and ended. In the study, I left the photo he had taken of us. The original. Not the copy Rachel had tried to weaponize. The real one. The moment he'd captured without knowing it would become a turning point. I placed it on the desk. Taped a small note underneath. For the one who listened. Then I turned off the lights, locked the door, and left the keys with the agent. The house was going on the market. Not out of spite. Out of necessity. Because some places carry too many ghosts. And I wasn't in the business of managing grief anymore. I was rebuilding. From ground that was finally stable. The last piece of the estate transfer hit the bank the following Wednesday. Clean. Final. Documented. Monica called that afternoon. She said, it's done. I didn't say much. Just nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Because the truth was, it wasn't done. Not really. Not until I faced what I'd been avoiding all along. I opened the last folder Harold had left on that USB. It wasn't financial. It was personal. Letters. To me. Unsent. From years ago. One for each birthday. Starting at 13. Short. Unpolished. But they were his. I saw how she looked at you today. Don't let it in. You're more than her coldness. If you ever feel alone, remember, you're not a mistake. You're the counterbalance. One day you'll understand why I stayed silent. I hope you forgive me. I couldn't breathe for a moment. Not out of sadness, but out of clarity. I had spent years wondering why Harold hadn't fought harder. Why he'd let Patricia shape so much of what I suffered. But I saw now, he hadn't been silent. He'd been storing his words for when I could carry them. And I could now. Every one of them. What remained wasn't revenge. It was peace. But I still had one more thing to do. And it had nothing to do with family. Grief changes form when you're no longer looking for answers. It becomes a quiet thing. Not emptiness, just space. I took a week off after the final transfer posted. No press release. No vacation photos. Just absence. I stayed in a small rental near the coast, one of the places Harold used to take me when I was younger. The kind of place where the wind never really stopped and the ocean didn't ask for anything back. I brought only one bag. No laptop. No phone calls. Just Harold's ledger and the letters. I reread them all. They didn't say anything new. But that wasn't the point. They were proof that I'd been seen. And for someone who'd spent so much of her life being edited out of the narrative, that meant more than justice ever could. I spent the mornings walking. The afternoons reading. Evenings watching the tide go out. It wasn't healing. Not in the romantic sense. It was reckoning. A reconciliation between the version of me that used to ask for permission, and the one who didn't need to anymore. On the last day, I sat in the sand with my notebook and made a list. Not of goals. Just truths. I am no longer waiting for their version of me to collapse. I know the difference between being loved and being useful. Silence isn't the absence of power. Sometimes it's the control of it. I don't owe them softness to prove I'm not cruel. I am allowed to leave the story unfinished, for them. When I came back home, I didn't check for messages. There were a few, one from Monica, confirming the final title had cleared, one from Jason, and signed, saying he was sorry for how things happened, but never specifying what he meant. I didn't reply. Letting go doesn't always look like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like not chasing the apology. That weekend, I visited one of the smaller locations, the shop Harold had started with, the one where I used to count receipts in the back room while he restocked shelves by hand. The same cashier was there. She remembered me. She said, "You look like him when you concentrate." I replied, "He always said I looked like my mother." She smiled faintly. "Not when you concentrate." I stayed after closing. Walked the aisles slowly, touching the corners of shelves I knew by memory. Ran my fingers across the grain of the old checkout counter, still scratched in the same spot it had been for 20 years. Then I walked into the office. Sat at the desk. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was borrowing his world. It was mine now. Not because of the papers or the money. But because I hadn't let them take it. Because I'd held the line. People always say revenge is sweet. But that's not what this was. This was steady. This was surgical. This was earned. Patricia never showed up again. No lawsuit. No scandal. Just silence. I heard she moved to another state. Downsized. Started over in a new community that didn't know the version of her she'd worked so hard to protect. Or maybe reinvented herself as someone better. I hoped she did. Not for her sake. But for the sake of whoever she met next. Rachel opened a wellness brand online. All soft lighting and affirmations. I never visited the site. But sometimes her posts showed up in my suggested feed. She looked peaceful. And if that peace was real, if she'd found a way to detach herself from the bitterness she once weaponized, then that was its own kind of victory. Jason eventually joined a different company. Lower title. Less control. But from what I heard, he was actually doing well. He stopped drinking. That meant something. And Craig? He disappeared the way quiet men do when they realize the power they borrowed is no longer on loan. I didn't chase them. I didn't block them either. I just let the story finish where it wanted to. And started writing my own. 6 months later, we opened a new store. Smaller footprint. Local vendors. Training programs for single mothers re-entering the workforce. I named it Listen. The plaque didn't explain why. But I knew. It was the thing I'd learned too late, and now held too tightly to ever forget. Listen before you inherit. Listen before you defend. Listen before you decide who deserves what. Because sometimes, the people who speak the least are the ones holding up the ceiling. The first week, a little girl came in with her grandmother. She pointed at the name on the wall and asked what it meant. Her grandmother said, "It's a reminder. To pay attention to the right things." She wasn't wrong. We didn't keep that photo of Harold and me in the office. I took it home. It sits in my hallway now, next to the mirror. Not because I need to remember what happened. But because I need to remember what didn't. What I didn't become. What I didn't repeat. What I chose instead. Legacy. And every morning when I pass it, I nod to the girl I used to be, the one who stayed quiet too long. And to the woman I am now. Still quiet. But never again silent. And that's enough. That's the ending.